of iniquity and a shadow out of time worse and worse, or out of the fry pan and into the fire. Copyright 2015 Darcy-John Bouchard. Inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. Prologue. This fable warns us that when we are avoiding present dangers, we should not fall into even worse peril. Abstemious, Fable 20, The Fish and the Frying Pan. At last, Faustus found himself at the foot of a terrible black statue, of the winged, lion-headed hermaphroditic god Ahriman, its legs covered in tattoos of the 13 zodiac signs, holding the key to heaven aloof in its left hand and a rolled scroll in its right hand, a serpent wrapped around it. Ahriman had an enormous ectoplasmic dripping erection. "I am Ahriman, prince of this world," spake the statue. The air reeked of rotten, smutty feculence. Faustus felt his life's blood run cold as his heart ceased beating and the warmth drain out of his flesh, leaving him trembling and breathless, more dead than alive. He knew that he was in the presence of pure demonic evil. An unambiguous feminine spirit releasing black light swooshed serpentine-like around Ahriman, and Faustus, too, exploring the cringing mortal shivering in fear at the foot of the statuesque monstrosity. Faustus felt his throat parched dry, and he thirsted. His ears began to fill with a sound like the buzzing of countless flies. "Oh God! I don't want to die here like this," whimpered Faustus. The evil demoness, Z, appeared and hovered in front of the whimpering man's face. "It is I who first formed your miserable body of flesh, puny mortal, imprisoning within it the weak particle of light you call your soul. My soul is immortal," saith Faustus to the invisible power. "You can do what you like to my flesh." He shuddered, "But you will never do any harm to my divine soul." Ahriman laughed. "I am mother of demons," Z tyrolized, spewing diseased phlegm into his face, wetting sparks which burning him. "I am the corruption of death," hissed Z, "avarice and lust, the source of every wrong which plagues humanity." "You cannot make me forget my divine origins," Faustus boldly responded. "You will not prevent me from finding my salvation." He spun about, somehow finding the strength and determination to flee this new, vile horror, and he ran headlong into the Stygian darkness surrounding the awful place. His legs feeling like rubber, and his heart sinking like lead within him, his breath caught up and held prisoner by chattering teeth, oozing with cold sweat, Faustus ran, guided only by his fear. The malevolent black light followed quickly behind him, spurring him ever onwards into the grim darkness. As he tripped and stumbled, whether it be over rotting corpses or sharp rocks, he cared not, he only knew that he had to get away, at any cost. At long last he was alone, pursued no more, and he fell exhausted in a heap, his head reeling and his breath coming in gasps. Sitting alone on the cold, dead stone in the utter blackness, unable even to see his hand in front of his face, Faustus wept, bemoaning his sad fate. After wandering a while, stumbling through the darkness and the dim light of random slaggy fiery pits, dross scoria glowing orange and belching red sparks, crawling more upon his hands and knees than walking, Faustus saw what looked like a tenuous illumination afar off, and toward this he went. Gradually it grew brighter as he neared the light, and a dank, rotten smell grew more and more noticeable. A disgusting, nauseatingly rank odor, like of something dead and decaying. He began to make out numerous creeping, crawling, stinging, and biting bugs, centipedes and spiders. Then he saw a multitude of slimy salamanders, snakes, and frogs, slithering and crawling on the ground in the dim light around him. Large pale gray, slug-like creatures with large sucker mouths full of horn-like teeth and ringed with tentacles, oozing trails of slimy ectoplasm. Here and there were clusters of pale mushrooms with red and white dots, neon glowing in the darkness, and spitting spores into his face which he could not help but breathe in. The pool of iniquity incidite in silum cupiens videre charybdum. At last Faustus came to a pool of stinking filth made of drippings from the ceiling which fell into the sickly muck with a monotonous, repeating plop glop goop. The dim light he'd been attracted by was the ignis fatuus coming from spontaneous methane fires which spasmodically bubbled up from the mire's depths and combusted here and there upon the surface skin of the yucky bog. The margin of the foul mud was murlied with obscene offal which had been stirred up from the gunky sediment within the reeking shot-hile. He had to cover his mouth and nose with his garment to protect himself from the poisonous fumes and the stench. Unknown to Faustus, a formless grayish, horrid mass was reposed amid the slime and the vapors, nearly choking it from rim to rim, perpetually cobbing, quivering, and swelling, a miscreant abomination, headless, without organs or members, sloughing from its oozy edge in a slow, ceaseless wave, containing the amoebic seeds of things that were once the archetypes of earthly life. It was horrible and loathsome, a being of monstrous fecundity, spontaneously generating primordial single-celled organisms that poured forth unceasingly from its shapelessness, spawn of the prototype of all forms of life on earth, and from it, in manifold fission, were engendered things like bodiless legs or arms that flailed in the slime, or heads that rolled, or floundering bellies with fish fins, all manner of things malformed and miscreant, all being devoured by divers disembodied mouths. Within the Iosus Naturae, rising from the iniquitous pool was a diaphanous black, shapeless, malevolent mist forming a putrid, living fog, like a gelatinous body filled with an exploding fireworks display of electromagnetic X-ray radiation which transmutated into a swirling, black vortex emitting an annoying static popcorn noise. A smoky entity with the travesty of a human face rose up out of it, dissipating into a multitude of hazy entities, then appearing as vast undulating ooze, bubbling and writhing hellish vapor, a festering, whirling and churning mass, putting forth tentacled appendages and reabsorbing them. The bubbles bursting on its surface revealed blistery, hate-filled eyes and strange staring, weepy eyes, tentacled floating eyes, slobbering mouths, all screaming and laughing insanely, all mutagenic, merging together and persisting in being before violently separating apart again or being torn asunder by yet other indescribable luminous monstrosities, so complex that Faustus' eyes could not recognize any discernible, definable shapes at all. A dark, smoky column with red malevolent eyes and grotesque faces rose from the cloud over the pool. Two horrid nebulous masses of shape-changing vapor formed within it, from which other faceless eyes, churning tentacles, and frothing maws emerged. Then a mysterious pillar of dazzling light manifesting pure malevolence took shape, a crackling, sparking shard of lightning which, after split seconds, exploded with a deafening bang into numerous luminous spherical balls of ultraviolet lightning stinking of sulfur. Some of these fiery balls were small and harmless looking, but others appeared as large, dangerous objects, all of them hovering and floating in the hallucinogenic excretion, discharging spiderwebs of white-hot pulsing, flickering light at each other, burrowing the tips of these into or exploring each other's bodies, coating one another in a bright blue and indigo-colored luminous plasma which shivering with synaptic electricity. A great amorphous incandescent ball of psionic energy, spread itself into a web of giant talons of luminosity. Faustus watched as a rolling cloud of ebony darkness with a swirling vortex of steaming boreal cold manifested and poured out over the edges of the pool, its reeking vapors churning at his feet, filling the cavern to its furthest depths, and his mind, filling with the unpleasant vision, overflowed with fear, horror, despair, anxiety, and sadness. He was filled with revulsion as, rising from the abysmal darkness, the crawling chaos came, full of semi-transparent creatures which were continually fading in and out of reality, floating around him yet unaware of his presence, great shining balls of energy, parasitic life forms, of sorts, neither really plant nor animal, pale green, planarian-like flatworms, totally unstable, constantly forming shapes and disrupting as they neared him, on all sides, a great unrestrained mass, an insatiable, ever-changing illusion passing around him, over him, through him, and likewise each other, dissolving as they departed, devouring one another or being devoured. Faustus watched as tiny, flesh-eating creatures, microbial plague-carrying entities, and fungin entities with suckering tentacles and tendrils gathered together, like a congregation of frenzied parasitic pilot fish feasting on gore and cruor. Bluish slime seemed to drip from on high, and gigantic amoebae with numerous eyes floated around shimmering columns of twisting shafts of gleaming luster. A nameless misty, shapeless thing, a dark blue-green mist which caused a sense of terror within Faustus as it approached, with an eye of flame inside of it, as did a shapeless, man-sized purplish aura, spitting and crackling with powerful electric arcs, projecting malignant energy and throwing off radiating subatomic particles of other dimensional unreality. A plump, huge-breasted yellow-green female figure about the size of an infant, without a face, and having dozens of pencil-thin root-like strands extending from it, reaching for him, caressing his clammy flesh, delving into his every orifice, including his eye sockets, searching out the meaty part of his soul, this shivering within his flesh, within his dreamish emotions, and these chilled icy and burning. Then, emerging from his thoughts, springing forth from his forehead as Athena/Minerva didst burst forth out of Zeus/Jove's thoughts, came a vaporous red entity, surrounded by a multitude of infinitesimally small red lights, floating amongst semi-visible polyps dripping mucus and gelatinous, shape-shifting goo, forming and dissolving at random. Descended upon these in a vicious feeding frenzy, coming swiftly from out of the utter black emptiness, were a multitude of immaterial bat-winged serpents and other seemingly protean beings made out of what seemed be living water, transparent, shimmering, sparkling, and shape-shifting semi-opaque masses of grayish-green ooze. A black, slimy mass covered in eyes and mouths descended from somewhere above, the gigantic, gelatinous mass of a glowing and multi-hued amoeboid, extending and retracting pseudopods, and bulging with pellucid cellulose coming with it, and a polypose, ravenous floating mass endowed with tentacles, drills and suckers, massive blob things made of entrails and eyes, all these things interacting with each other in a wet slapping suckering orgy. A monstrous entity manifesting as a horrible patchwork of flesh and soil and alien matter, lycanthropic changing into another shapeless entity, glowing with the colors of an unknown spectrum, beyond infrared or ultraviolet and nowhere found in between, having more permanency to its materiality, which came into being and persisted in the midst of the crawling chaos. A hideous tree-like horror with branches like rat's tails and weird pustules dripping amorphous jelly grew out of the pool, rooted in the belching, bubbling gas. Monstrous, whirling amorphous things perched in its branches, and things resembling worms, or lizards, crawled all over it, these being schmuckly eaten by the other things, but still the mortal man hapless in their midst remained unnoticed, unknown to the menagerie of monstrosities. Formless masses of entrails with 4 tentacles endowed with sharp claws and a huge, red-rimmed cycloptic eyes, having several smaller eyes scattered randomly along their hideous bodies, floated in the subtle, luminous radiation. Ropey black tentacles on pairs of stumpy, hooked legs, ugly spider-like horrors with gaping maws, and tiny rat-like creatures with human faces emerged from the swirling psionic rainbow-colored mist, taking shape and persisting for moments, then riotously tearing each other apart, and in their chummy gore, this being frenziedly devoured by horrifying oddly plant-like, carnivorous giant worm-like creatures, translucent, bluish, oval-shaped protoplasmic jelly-like creatures floating as if in boiling liquid nitrogen. Gigantic squid-like worms also swam in the same vaporous atmosphere as if flying through the air. As did a blob of darkness endowed with tentacles. Large, pinkish fungoid things, crustacean-like entities the size of a man, fluttered about like bats. Where their heads should have been was a convoluted ellipsoid composed of pyramid, fleshy rings, and covered in antennae, their bodies bearing numerous sets of paired appendages and possessing a pair of membranous bat-like wings that extend from the forelimbs to the hind limbs or spike-tipped tails, but they were unable to fly well, more resembling drunken butterflies, or moths, in their flight than birds. And then, pulling themselves from out of the fetid stinking slough, came grayish-green anthropoids with white underbellies and fishy, frog-like features, with prodigious bulging eyes that never closed and palpitating gills on the sides of their necks, shiny and slippery-looking things with scaly ridges upon their backs and long webbed paws, pulling themselves up onto the land and hopping, sometimes on 2 limbs and sometimes on 4, croaking and braying as they emerged. Dagon, having the form of a fish from his navel down, rose up out of the abomination, and with him was Hydra, sprouting from the ooze, a virulent serpent-like monster with many heads, some human and some alien, sobbing and grimacing as if in great agony, and having poisonous breath. They were accompanied by formless masses of shape-shifting watery things like gruesome fish, transparent viper fish as black as night with long, needle-like teeth and hinged lower jaws, enlarged eyes, luminous photophores on their bodies, and one long dorsal fin which swam around them, as did menacing-looking dark brown fang-tooth ogrefish, with short bodies, long heads, oversized mouths, and long spines on their head, ferocious. Predatorily dragonfish with large heads and mouths equipped with many sharp, fang-like teeth, and a long light-producing barbel waving back and forth before its mouth as a lure, and common black devils, with large mouths and sharp, fang-like teeth, and long, modified dorsal spine tipped with a luminous photophore, blinking off and on to attract prey, none of these monster fish being more than 6 inches long. There were larger fish, too, enormous stargazers with 2 dead eyes on top of their heads and 2 large poison spines, and capable of causing electric shocks, blobfish, gelatinous masses with densities slightly less than water, big red jellyfish with fleshy tentacles for catching prey, and very ugly snaggle-tooth fish. Greatly elongated, pelagic lampiform oarfish, black swallowers capable of swallowing things up to 10 times greater than their size, gulper with wide, loose-hinged lower jaws, growing up to 6 feet long, giant isopods, like massive sea lice, scavenged in the thick mud beneath them, hideous lampreys, amphipods, black dragons, and goblin sharks with eel-like tails and super long snouts, for detecting tiny electrical charges given off by living beings, and retractable jaws, and rat tail. Ghost sharks, or long-nosed chimera, nosing the sludge bottom and scanning for electrical impulses. All this Faustus unwillingly witnessed. He would have run, but his legs were like weighted anchors holding him fast in his place. His heart pounded in his ears so that the horrid sounds which had all along accompanied everything his unbelieving eyes had so beheld was blocked out. Then, at last, Faustus felt his ears shrinking, his eyes bulge and become unblinking, his head narrow and his hair began falling out, his skin becoming scabrous, changing into scales, and his neck developing folds which became gills, and within his mind developed an overpowering urge to join the monstrosities in the fetid pond. Thence Faustus witnessed a bearded, winged lion-faced serpent approaching, wielding a flaming sword. As it neared him, Faustus could see that its body was full of flaming eyes and covered in freckle-like spots, with swelling buboes, or gavicholos, on its groin, neck, and armpits, oozing pus and bleeding, some as large as an apple, others as an egg. It was feverish, having difficulty breathing, and vomiting blood. "I am Samael, the destroying angel of the Lord," this angel of death said, "the blind god, the killer of children and slaughter of women. It is I who pours molten lead and sulfur down the throats of men, throttling and beheading them. I alone make no distinction between good or bad. There is no man that sees me and can deliver his soul from my hand. I am the consort of Lilith the uncircumcised, Adam's first wife, who created a host of demon children within her dead womb to destroy humankind. I am the seducer who tempted Eve to sin, he who seduced her and impregnated her with Cain. Yeah, I be the corrupt angel that God castrated and threw out of heaven." Faustus, barely able to form the words, squeaked in a tiny shaking voice, "Whiter go ye now. To fetch the damnable soul of Iabum, Job, the pious." Thereupon Faustus prayed to God in these words, "O may it be thy will, my God, and the God of my fathers, not to let me fall into the hands of this angel." "I am not here for you, Faustus," responded Samael, "but if I were, I assure you, no prayer to God would save you from me." "What is this terrible, stinking place?" asked Faustus, feeling relieved and somewhat bolder now. "The pool is called Original Sin," said Samael. "If you're tired of life, drink from it and you'll soon forget." "I should think not," responded Faustus, aghast. "This was once a puddle," Samael continued. "Eventually it will flood the entire subterranean realm and pour out over the living world of man and beast, and you will all drown in the corpulence of your own excremental sin. Then Faustus saw a withered soul which he had earlier seen thrown into the open grave before sin, at the gateway into hell through which he had passed to come to this awful place, and it emerged from the pool and wandered off, becoming just another lost face in the crowd of the damned, speaking to Faustus in passing, saying, "Death has not been swallowed up in victory." Thus Samael vanished amidst a multitude of fireballs and lightning bolts, and cometh upon Faustus a floating conglomeration of glowing spheres, strange dark orbs and malignant congeries of iridescent globes, sparkling, multicolored orbs of swirling, crackling light, about the size of a house cat, pulsing and trembling and constantly shooting out little spears of lightning which coalesced into tiny spears of crystal. An unsteady orb of bluish flame and crimson bursts of lightning surrounded by many energy-draining points of fiery light, gathering together and forming into a collective hive mind, and buzzing like the sound of innumerable maggots. Faustus felt as if he was going to spontaneously erupt into flames, and the hive mind unformed again, as another alien race of living energy manifested in the form of green spheres of pulsing light, which glowed, exploded and burnt out. Then yet another alien race, resembling writhing, green mist lit from within by unnatural light, came into being by shifting in and out of and in between the extra-dimensional realities which Faustus was experiencing. Something he perceived was from beyond the space-time continuum. A great black-bodied green eye surrounded by a mass of tentacles hovered over a great mass of toad-like monsters. It was accompanied by a quintet of vulture-headed humanoids. Vaporous brains, obscenely bloated and oblate, floated in the pareidoliac ever-changing imagery, a festering, amorphous mass, constantly blasting, burping, belching, and erupting violently, spewing out bits of churning lava like detritus. Another hideous entity composed of dozens of human faces set into a thick worm-like mass of sickly, purple-veined futanalic muscle, neither phallic nor vulva, took shape as the foul mess coalesced into one unnatural substance, sustaining momentarily before dissolving into a chorus of orchestrated madness. And in the viscous semi-liquescent substance which remained in its wake, being quite opaque and sooty in color, floated a very squat and pot-bellied entity, its head like a monstrous amorphous toad, its body covered in short fur, giving somehow a vague sensation that it was both a bat or a sloth. Its sleepy lids were half lowered over its dull, globular eyes, the tip of its queer tongue issued from its fat mouth. A grey festering blob of infinite malevolence was born from its bile and tears, a huge winged octopus-like creature with 6 eyes, and a gigantic black mass of tentacles with a single green eye in the center. All this came into being, and as readily as it did so did it cease to exist, never noticing the mortal man trembling teary-eyed in its midst. An immobile blob of living, sentient darkness, torn from the primal fabric of the cosmos at the center of the universe, came, a vague shimmering oily pitch resonating a discordant screeching, howling noise like static, descending upon Faustus, enveloping him completely, oozing into his very pores, and filling all the empty places within him, as if he were absorbing it, but still it was unaware of him. Faustus, though, was aware of everything that was happening in the strange glowing mist around him, and he was more than just afraid, more than merely terrified. An entity of living sound manifested as a huge monstrous being, then a bluish-brown slimy monstrosity riddled with holes and malformed excrescence like heads, and a titanic mass of jelly, all forming, passing through him, and each one leaving him changed as a man, having each taken something of him away with them, before dissolving back into the nothingness from which they were born. Next to appear in procession were a wet, warty globe of entrails and guts covered with countless ovoid pustules and spider-webbed with a network of long, narrow tunnels, each pustule bearing larvae, a gelatinous mass extruding golden tentacles, a huge mass of living, sentient magma, an amorphous, writhing mass of bubbling nuclear protoplasmic gel, a gigantic spongy, fleshy mass covered in myriad eyes and spines, a mostly invisible egg-shaped monster with a mostly human-like face of a gelatinous consistence and covered in tentacled suckers. These were all swirling around each other, passing through each other, yet oblivious of each other. There were, also, a multitude of truly horrible amphibious creatures, eyeless and bloated horrors with 8 tentacular arms and 4 legs, with a single sponge-like organ in the middle of its forehead and a toothless mouth endowed with tentacles, and a dark cloudy mass with tentacles absorbing the other interdimensional beings, and a formless hideous hermaphroditic pupating larva-like tentacled entity served by pale, soft-bodied minion spawn. There was a dead black leafless oak tree with a single red eye, and it radiated intense heat. Sitting in it were gigantic, bat-winged, vaguely humanoid things with detached eyes, gaunt, thin, black, faceless shapes accompanying them, their skin slick-looking and rubbery, each sporting a pair of inward-facing horns upon their heads, and having clawed hands, a long barbed tail, and flying with torn, membranous wings, but making no sound, and these suckled black milk from the numerous breasts of a pulpy black mass which appeared with them, a slimy, gelatinous creature with innumerable detached human-like eyes and mouths, surrounded by sticky, smothering black snowflakes. There was also a colossal red mass of tentacles and eyes, leeching vampirically off the other illusionary nightmares, and 2 other repulsive things, a vast reptile with a crown of snaking feelers and empty sockets in place of eyes, and with it was a huge tentacled mollusk with snaking appendages, spewing digestive fluid. Another huge mass of coiled, withering tentacles, and a bristly substance with large gaping maws, made up of tentacles and spidery limbs. And an amorphous monster of prodigious size, covered in a multitude of eyes, mouths, projections, and both male and female genitalia. Then Alila, the queen of perdition and goddess of all iniquities, noticed Faustus, her coming forth from the terrifying illusion and manifesting in the flesh before him, and he broke into a cold sweat as she touched him, caressing his flesh through his garment as if he were naked, and the meat of his body chilled, shivered, and repelled instinctively at her touch. She scratched him, and drawing blood, she smiled. The other percolating monstrosities sensed the fresh blood and became agitated, and the incorporeal beings began sniffing and whining and salivating. A great shadow thing with 2 ugly red glowing glaring eyes looked right at Faustus, as if they could not only see him, but suck his frail mortality right out of his shivering bones into them, cannibalizing his sanity and devouring his soul. Feeling uneasy and nauseous, Faustus instinctively moved backwards away from it, but its eyes followed him. Faustus came to the grim realization that it could see him, and something hidden deep within his insect brain began to scream, a scream which echoed throughout his primeval memories until finally emerging from betwixt his dry, cracked lips as a weak squeak. Then a huge, scaly bird-like creature with bat wings resembling an elephant with a horse's head, slimy skin, and 2 strong talons, flew around him, as did a huge faceless sphinx, a jet-black gargoyle-like fiend with snake-like eyes and large membranous wings extending from each 6 pairs of arms, beneath and around which dozens of long serpentine tentacles writhed, was also flying in the shimmering, hazy mirage, a gigantic octopus-like horror with serpentine eyes and detachable tentacles which were able to move independently of it swam around them, as if it were also flying, and a dragon-like reptilian entity flew with them, all becoming, being, and not being at the same time, all circling him like a pack of hungry sharks. A swarm of large flying insects and gigantic larva-like horrors were fed on by reptilian birds, giant purple spiders, giant spiders with human faces, spider-eyed bat-like horrors, parasitic insectoids, huge flying scorpions with ant-like heads and antennae, colossal compound eyes, and gaping maws dripping venom, all being preyed on in turn by gigantic, multicolored toads with 1 eye, a proboscis, crab-like claws, and tentacles below the mouth, and gigantic worm-like serpents. And all these were being devoured by ravenous plant-like parasites and other sentient plants, which sprouted and grew and withered within fleeting moments. A lustrous orb floating at the center of a whirling vortex of razor-sharp, metallic-looking blades. A gigantic beating heart, an inky shadow, a ropey, tentacled, slimy, squirming mass with a single alien face, a great tentacled eye, octopoid monsters, horrible eel-like things. A 3-eyed, gilled, proboscidean monster with a globular torso, 6 long, sinuous limbs ending in black paws with crab-like claws, and covered in what appeared to be hair, but was, in actuality, tentacles, swam around in the thick sludge with other three-eyed parasitic octopoids, and monstrous, barrel-shaped sea worms with tentacles and jawless lamprey-shaped eels with toothed, funnel-like mouth. Faustus beheld titanic raptorial fiends with a huge single eye and a crown of tentacles fly above him and, looking down, he saw colossal glowing worms with a starfish-shaped heads writhing at his feet, and giant three-eyed slugs with metallic spines and tiny, pyramid-like teeth. He felt nauseous and faint but dared not collapse amongst the parasitic helminths and nematodes at his feet, in the methane emissions creeping from out of the pool, and carbon dioxide steaming everywhere in the atmosphere, digesting the organic matter, the very rocks around him, coating them in a stinking, slippery slime. There were huge, furry, almost human-like toads, gigantic black toad-like creatures, two-headed bats, gigantic ghost-like hogs, rat-like things with ever-changing human-like faces, and tentacled, scaled bat-winged entities. With these monsters came a menagerie of small, vampiric creatures with webbed hands and feet, black, fanged demons with tentacles instead of arms, a giant snake with human arms covered in scales, a sloth-like thing with bat wings and a terrible face, a black, fanged, cycloptic demon with arms like swaying serpents, and a hooved, hairless man with pitch-black skin and Caucasian features. Giant hairless dingo-like fiends and wolf-like things moved together in packs, occasionally fighting amongst themselves. A 1.5-meter-tall homunculus, slender and tanned, with a crimson tentacle for a head, a glossy tongue and sharp green teeth, was floating in their midst. Because of the continuing stress and anxiety of the ordeal, Faustus was suffering from a terrible migraine, and his vision blurred, so that objects began to appear out of focus and hazy. He began to intermittently see oblique and overlapping images of the same object, as if he was drunk. Dumbfounded, his mind out of control, he felt vertiginous, giddy, and befuddled. Feathered serpents with flaming nostrils beat the air close around him with their wings. A 4-meter-tall lizard-like horror with 6 legs and a sadistic mouth filled with viscous fangs crawled out of the iniquitous pool and would have crawled right over him, but its spectral limbs just passed through him. Then came a group of gigantic, multi-armed freaks and other burrowing fiends, serpent men with bats' wings, succubus-like fiends with alien traits and tentacles instead of hair, a huge faceless creature with various appendages sprouting from its head, a beard of oozing horns, and many reddish teats and fish-like gills covering its egg-shaped body. Then a hideous, gigantic, legless dark bird-like horror swathed in dark flames, its long neck topped with a black lump, half of which was endowed with a big glowing eye and the other being covered in innumerable tentacles swooshed past him so close that he could smell the disgusting thing. Faustus' stomach revolted, he gagged, choking on his own puke. The darkness around him rapidly chilled, and the flapping sound of large unseen wings steadily increased in volume. Furthermore, Faustus suffered an irritation of the eyes and intense reaction to the psionic supernatural light so severe that he thought he'd gouge them out of his head, and he was depressed to the utter depths of his being, but beyond weeping, although his eyes wept burning tears from his inflamed eyes. The shadows in the rocks beyond the nightmarish manifestation began to swirl, churn and coalesce into dark shapes which had more substantial substance than any of the things he'd seen yet. These rose up out of the blackness, emerging from behind stalagmites and speleothem columns, alone or in groups. Some wandered away, but many drew near to Faustus, and these were definitely aware of his presence, yet if they tried to touch him, and some did, or at least they tried, but their chimerical flesh passed right through him. His stomach turned, his mind reeled, he felt qualmish. They pawed at him, clawed at him, struck out at him, and tried to grab him. Some even tried to bite him, yet others spat on him, but nothing they did affected him physically. Eventually these shady creeps would lose interest in him and lose themselves again in the riotous mob they were quick becoming, and the emptiness around him became a mosh pit of madness full of thrasher-like humanoids, wrinkled mummies with stiff, outstretched claws, blurry, tentacled she-vampires of supernatural beauty, humanoid torsos with tentacles instead of limbs, and short necks ending in a toothless, featureless mouths, large, bloated, tentacled humanoids trying to eat each other's brains. A beautiful red-haired sorceress with webbed feet and square, nail-less toes slowly formed, developing from an embryonic state and maturing, her belly swelling, convulsing, suddenly spasming as her limbs began cramping, twisting, and distorting, until at last she exploded spewing putrescent gore everywhere. A brooding, deathly pale, totally hairless gestalt human-like being made up of millions of tiny white spidery things was all that remained of her. Tall, humanoid snakes and spider-like reptilians descended upon these, tearing them into bloody pieces as it screeched in agony. A feather-winged goat-headed black humanoid with yellow eyes and horns, saggy, lactating breasts dripping yellowish-green pus, and an enormous syphilitic erection seeping stinking black semen, its body covered in scales, having hooked goat legs and androgyne arms, the one raising a flaming torch and the other holding a human skull. A once human vampiric horror, its face endowed with stringy appendages, yellow eyes, and a hideous beaked maw, plagued by buboes and other secreting sores. A half-human half-goat fawn-like creature, from the head to the waist being human, and having great horns frolicked around it, lauding it with suckling kisses, lapping up the thing's fetid discharges, filthy goop, stinking lactatus, sperm, and oozing slime dripping out its arse. A sadistic mind-controlling misty, silvery being with an inhuman face, enveloped in green flames, a tall humanoid with an eyeless anemone-like face and a beaked grinding mouth, a hideous howling giant with a tentacle for a face, a mouthless humanoid with whitish tentacles, all emerging from the emptiness, momentarily existing and then fading into nihility and forgotten. There seemed no end to the nightmarish creatures. Then quick became a vast cold, gray, ball of spinning fire that froze whatever it touched, abiogenetically sparked into existence, and, as it matured, spewed out an unsteady orb of blue flame, as fire vampires, resembling crimson bursts of lightning, drained energy from beings around them, absorbing all the memories of the victim, having a hive mind. Then, in the illumination, Faustus beheld a loathsome being resembling a human corpse, decayed into tones of green, black, and blue, dripping pieces of rotting flesh hanging from its bones, with prodigious claws or talons dangling from its fingers, and from its undead lidless eye sockets stared black eyeballs, boring holes right through his mind into the back of his head. Faustus looked away, but instead of finding any peace of mind, he saw other human corpses which were more wormy maggot than human, and corpse-eating, canine-like humanoids, undead zombies, mutated humanoids, and scaly humanoids with tiger-like faces and tentacles in the place of whiskers. Green toad-like humanoids with gelatinous bodies and emerald eyes were hopping around, and bat-like, hornet-like human corpses and faceless bat-like humanoids flew around him. He saw tall, multicolored tripod beings with strange crests and 3 eyes, and tall, shadowy humanoid figures with yellow glowing eyes and strange protrusions like the branches of a dead tree. Half-frog, half-fish humanoids were swimming in the air as if it were water, and mouthless, grotesque humanoids with pale, protruding tentacles swam with them, bony, lion-headed humanoids with 4, 7-clawed arms with tentacles in place of legs, and mouths encompassing 3 long tongues wandered aimlessly, floating in the poisoned atmosphere. Seductive female humanoid entities covered with vines and vegetal parts plied Faustus with soft caress and kisses, whilst painting his garments with dampening mold. The surreal emanation was manifesting, but Faustus was too preoccupied to notice that the phantasmy was beginning to affect him physically, not just consciously, empathically, and psychically. Ferocious and towering wolf-like humanoids with bat wings began to howl. Violent humanoid cannibals covered in coarse, matted hair with large protruding ears and proboscidean noses began partial merging and conjoining or banging into each other, as did other grotesque 3-toed, umber-colored, fur-covered humanoids howling like dogs. They were joined in the melee by hairless, cyclops-like hypnotic beings with dead gray skin and huge hands and feet, reptilian and serpentine humanoids, cyanotic humanoids, and crocodile-headed reptilian humanoids. Other humanoids had rough, leathery bodies and huge claws, others kangaroo-like legs and feet. There were thin, lanky humanoids with long, pointed heads, huge claws and sharp teeth, hairy cannibals, furry giants with mouths that open sideways, and plump, toad-like humanoids. Pillars of light formed and faded in the midst of the ghastly mob of abhorrent humanoids as they swarmed around Faustus. He could see their black, empty auras, and trails they left in their wake which followed after them. He soon had difficulty in distinguishing between them, and as they were conjoining, merging together into other grotesque quarries, and the shifting hues became more and more static, grainy, and distorted. The lunacy which swallowed him whole, digesting his sanity, was accompanied by a high-pitched squealing screech and a ringing death rattle in his ears. Then a tall, larva-like entity with hundreds of segmented, talon tendrils appeared and began feeding upon the humanoids and their trails. The revolting odor of excrement flooded into his nostrils, yet, even his eyes began to ache, so disgusting was the olfactory sensation. He gagged, vomit spewing out of his very bowels and filling his mouth, but puking out of him only in the form of a noxious gas. His guts shook in pain, vice-like pain which filled his mind with a burning, searing white light of electrostatic shock. The poor soul reeled on his feet and staggered. There were, also, formless human beings made of psychic energy, colorful, warm, electric, and humming, and sentient alien beings appearing in a swirling and boiling pure blackness of cold steam. Tall, bluish humanoids with blank eyes and boneless fingers, entities made of living sound. Gray aliens, small-bodied sexless humanoid beings with enlarged heads and large opaque eyes with no discernible iris or pupil, possessing reduced forms of or a complete lack of noses, ears, or sex organs, having very small mouths, elongated bodies, small chests, and lacking muscular definition and a visible skeletal structure. And a bronze-skinned humanoid horror with the body of a scarab beetle and having tentacles sprouting from its head and the wings of a hawk, the legs of a man and the toes and claws of a lion, its eyes glowing. A great thing about a mile long, chanting and exuding strange acid, came charging through the earth at fantastic speed, in dreadful fury, seemingly melting rock, but leaving no hole to mark its passing. Faustus, his courage long ago having left him, his legs shaking and rubbery, his feet like lead, began to lament, sobbing uncontrollably. At last he ran, pursued on all sides by a confused fracas of supernatural horrors and monstrosities which chased after him, clawing at him and biting him, and though their claws and fangs just passed through his body, the wounds they inflicted scratched and ripped and tore at his incorporeal, living psyche, chilling his pneuma at their awful rending. Touch. Faustus ran through the ever-changing illusion which entombed him, digesting his sanity as it persisted. Even the rocky ground beneath his feet radiated infrared and ultraviolet and unnatural flames. An ominous red comet fell before him, stopping him in his fright-filled flight, and this took the shape of a pitch-black semi-humanoid figure with a flat reptilian head, earless and noseless, surrounded by a hellish nimbus of changing, fiery light, dimly revealing its shape. Its limbs swayed and writhed like boneless serpents, ending in sharp, hard claws. Faustus remembered the words of the immortal bard. Cowards die many times before their deaths, the valiant never taste of death but once. In the vapor, Faustus could see that the ground was festering with gigantic slimy worm-like creatures covered in a viscous goo, some several hundred feet long, creeping and crawling, gnawing on each other and burrowing into the rock. There were also gigantic pale, worm-like horrors, and levitating, sinuous, glowing creatures, and massive worm-like crptyds, bright red and spewing forth acid that turned anything it touched into a yellow goo. And in their midst was a colossal worm with tentacles for a head, and a gigantic, whitish worm with a huge maw and eyes made of dripping globules of blood, and another gigantic, slimy worm with a mass of black tentacles around its maw. And tentacled reddish-orange horrors covered with spines, myriads of blue glaring eyes, and gaping maws, and thick paxillae, having long, slender, tapering tentacles, each with a dark purplish-gray contrasting stripe, running from the center of the body to the tip. These contain no pedicellariae but the underside of the arms have 2 rows of tube feet. The wretched man, his sanity being thus stretched to the limits of his endurance, shut his eyes, squeezing them tightly and pushing the butt of his palms into them to darken them even more, his fingers squeezed into tight balls, and his whole body trembling. At last, after long moments of sobbing, he found his composure again, and dared open his eyes once more. A shadow out of time thus featly connuate himself out of the frying pan fire into the fire. The Confutation of Tyndall's Answera, Sir Thomas More, 1532, thus, as the last of the spectral light show failed, leaving Faustus on his hands and knees, cold sweating, feverish, panting for breath, feeling quite photophobic but once again alone, safely entombed in inky blackness, and after a while, him resting and recovering his senses, his eyes growing somewhat accustomed to the Stygian light, he sensed more than he saw, a tall, swarthy shade of a man resembling an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Of enormous intellectual and psychic power, being wrapped from head to foot in the dirty, tattered, and torn linen wrappings of its mummification, a shadow out of time, horrible, more horrible than anything he'd ever seen before, more horrible than anything he'd as of yet experienced, more frightening and beyond anything he'd ever imagined, an unfathomable whispering nightmare gloating of destroying the human race and the earth, holding its wriggling, wagging tongue in one hand, and its bleeding, still beating heart in the other. And black, empty vacuous humanoid shape, wearing the plumed double crown of ancient Egypt with a holographic green pentacle aureole over it, its head constantly changing form, a bearded man, a jackal, a ram, a frog, a uraeus, a crocodile, an ape, but most often a cackling goose, all having one thing in common, 3 sparkling diamond eyes. This being came up to Faustus and, putting its tongue into its mouth, laid its cold hand upon Faustus' shoulder. Looking him in the eye and sending a soul-chilling fright creeping in through his eyes, seeping into all the hidden recesses of his soul. Thus, Faustus imagined that all his secrets were exposed to this shadow, and he felt the remorse of guilt, not so much for the many evils of his life but for the things he'd left unfinished or undone, and with it came the painful weltschmerz of shame. In short, he felt ridiculous. Pharaoh saith unto Faustus, there is no escape from life but death. There is no escape from death but resurrection, no resurrection but through salvation and transmutation, and no eternal everlastingness but through the second death of the mortal soul. You must cease waggling the tongue of your hidden thoughts and desires and surrender your heart to the Lord of the underworld that it may be weighed against the ostrich feather of Ma'at, man of perdition. It was thence that Faustus first noticed the malevolent bitch demon sitting at Pharaoh's feet. It had the hind quarters of a hippopotamus, torso and arms of a spotted leopard, and head of a crocodile. Fire was burning within its gaping maw and smoke seeping from its nostrils, and its eyes were empty, atramentus vacuums. This is not happening, this is not happening, was all Faustus could say, his voice a barely audible whisper, shaking his head, repeating his disbelief over and over, trying to convince himself that what was happening was not actually happening, or that it was some sort of a bad dream which he could wake up from, but it wasn't. It was all too real, and he wasn't asleep or dreaming a nightmare, he was awake and sentient of the hell he was in, and aware that there was no escape, no refuge to flee to, no sanctuary for his tormented psyche to flee to and hide. Covering his eyes with his hands, Faustus wept bitterly. I don't want to die. What you are experiencing is not life, man of dust. That meaty thing you are so fond of desperately clinging to belongs to Pharaoh, Pharaoh saith. Even the precious meat of your mind which you call yourself is not your own, but, instead, that collection of forgotten memories and lost hope belongs to us from the beginning of the most ancient times. You do not even know who you truly are, believing yourself to be the lie you were told to be. Faustus marveled, as the terror he had so recently been possessed with was inexplicably exorcised, yet all he could utter was, Are you God? I am not jealous, but have existed eons forgotten before Innes claimed reality as its own. All Faustus was able to reply to Pharaoh was the one word, Malgar. Have you no votive offering in atonement for the wasted moments of your life, Faustus, saith Pharaoh? No obelisk to barter me for more fleeting moments of your pathetic, animated conscious impermanence, to continue enduring your unsatisfactory soul-stoic suffering, to prolong this phenomenal, puny angst-ridden non-self which you know as yourself. Faustus patted his cloak furiously, exploring its pockets, digging his fingers into the deep, empty corners of the garment. Nothing, still nothing, but no, a small cylindrical metal object. And producing it from his pocket he presented it in an open hand to Pharaoh. It was a small lead coin inscribed with a pentacle, which he had hopes of transmuting it into gold. "This is all I have," he said. "Go now and die," saith Pharaoh. "I chose to live," answered Faustus, "of my own free will to power." "The whole world is grave," resounded a disembodied voice. "You were conceived and born in sin and subject to death. Even thy damnable soul hath its meager moments weighed and allotted thee from time long forgotten before ye first imagined ye were a living sentient thing and capable of independent thought and the free will to power. Every moment of yine existence hath been lived in this grave that you call existence, and the only reality is that all the world is one mass grave. Ye puny worms revel in narcissistically identifying within us, but there are no sentient creatures worthy of transmutation from baseness. Ye believe that in this life ye are living, that you be some majestic caterpillar, crawling from moment to moment in anticipation of emerging from yine chrysalistic pupation into angelic bliss, but you are, at best, a grubby maggot, and unworthy of the breath that ye reek of. O Faustus, you have never been alive and shall never know life, thou art but a dead thing and without purpose or value. You are a mistake that should have never happened." Thence didst a grotesquely obese blemmise appear. It was nebulous, lacking a head or neck, with a mouth in the palm of each hand. Stinking cannibalistic bugs crawled scuttling across its flesh, and it was surrounded by tattered eyeless figures. It held up its hands, exposing its mouths to Faustus, which began laughing, and speaking in ancient tongues long ago forgotten by men and unheard of for ages untold until this time, saying to Faustus, "The Lord of the earth is born." Conclusion: a fox caught in a trap asked a passing cock to get a stick and free him of the trap. But the smart cock brought the farmer who had the stick. The fox and the cock, or, the general peace, Aesop, everything about him was numb, and when it was not numbness that he felt, it was pain. Faustus nearly went mad on hearing the terrible sound which accompanied these awful manifestations: sucking sounds, screams, high-pitched howling and low-pitched moaning, reverberating thumping and poundings, noises beyond his comprehension which electrified his imagination and shivered his blood. Then came the fair locked phantom Lamia, having the head and torso of a hauntingly beautiful woman and a scaled serpent's body below the waist. She came upon him then, as he lay there with tears in his eyes, bemoaning his sad fate. She was vermilion-spotted, golden, green, and blue, and sprinkled with sparkling stars, for as she breathed, silver moons shone, luminous and lustre shimmering over the rainbow-colored tapestry of her scaly flesh. She inquired of him almost nonchalantly, "Why are you crying?" "Because I am doomed," cried Faustus, only then noticing her and looking up into her face for pity. "Oh, I've surely gone to hell." Lamia's face was distorted with grief and madness, her mouth stained with blood. She was cursed with the inability to close her eyes, and these red unblinking things she took out of her head and held in her hands close to his face, which really scared the living bejesus right out of Faustus, for looking into them was like looking into mirrors into his memories and his dreams, and his nightmares. She was also a sort of chameleon of changing colors with flaming hair, a sorceress and the first woman to give oracles. "Come now," said Lamia to Faustus, "you have no need to fear me. I won't hurt you." Faustus asked her, "What do you want?" "I want what any woman wants from a hot-blooded man," Lamia replied, her voice playfully cooing, whispering seductively, lustily licking her lips. "What did you think? That I was going to eat you?" And she laughed. Her laughter, though, did not relieve the growing panic within Faustus' mind. His heart raced, banging in his ears, his stomach had butterflies in it, and he was overcome with nausea. She reached out a long, taloned blood-stained finger and collected a teardrop which had fallen out of his woeful eyes and streamed down his cheek. This she raised to her mouth and gently, her long narrow black snake tongue slithered out from between her cold dead lips and she kissed. Faustus gathered his courage and looked into her face, and saw her long, dagger-like teeth, and his heart fell into his belly and all blood drained from his head, leaving his face even more deathly pale than hers. "I know what you want, Faustus," she said. "You want the simple love of a family, a home and a hearth, a reason to live and a purpose in life. Bert, I can give you all that and more. After all, I love, children." Faustus looked into the depths of the universe captured within her cold, dead staring eyes, and he felt utter hopelessness overcome him. She smiled, her tongue lolled out of her mouth and she drooled wantonly. "Just give in to your natural urges, Faustus," she lustily whispered. "I need you. Oh, I need you so very very badly. Oh, don't be cruel to me." Faustus felt his will leave him, as she hypnotically writhed before him. Her talons gliding over her belly and thighs, as she swayed over him. "Oh, end your aimless, tempestuous wandering, Faustus," she said with a sultry smile, "for you have found me at long last, and I am for you alone. Allow me to cool the hot flames within your blood." Lamia caressed Faustus, loosening his garment, kissing him, and Faustus felt his will turn to hers as desire enflamed his loins. "Leave that poor sod be," commanded a voice, the sound of many discordant voices shouting, laughing, crying, whispering, echoing, speaking in every language of the world, the ancient and the dead languages, too. She stiffened, screeching, "Who the hell do you think you are to come between Lamia and her prey?" "My name is Legion," saith a naked man suddenly in their midst, "for we are many, and we are here to fuck you up your dirty USS, that is if you have one, you uptight bitch." Then Legion began to oink like a herd of unclean swine, shaking his genitals at her and showing his buttocks to her, spreading his ass cheeks so that she could see his osh hail, and he farted. "Here's a kiss for you." The demon laughed and oinked some more. Like a disgusted spider which is forced to abandon its meal, she spat in Legion's face, saying, "FCKU, Legion, next time mind your own goddamned business." Legion began picking up rocks and throwing them at her as she slithered away, cursing them both. "I see you, Faustus," she hatefully cursed him, disappearing into the darkness. "I see you sitting under a tree, and I see your Chivihani, may she bring you nothing but shame and misfortune." Faustus, unable to believe his good luck, asked the naked man, "Why have you saved me?" "Darling," said Legion, draping himself wetly on Faustus, taking his bum into his hand and squeezing, and slipping his other hand into Faustus' loosened garment. "I saved you for myself, sweetie pie." And he tried to kiss Faustus, but he reacted violently, pushing Legion off him and stepping back. "No," said Faustus. "Don't be such a bitch," said Legion, laughing, his many voices coalescing in mock femininity. "Moral sweet talk doesn't always work and or the wicked deserve no aid." 1 Corinthians 15:50-54-50 Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, neither doth corruption inherit incorruption. And 51 Behold, I shew you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. 52 In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. 53 For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and what be mortal must put on immortality. 54 So when the corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and the mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. And
Iniquity.